Hello, and welcome to the History of the American Presidency. I've been teaching this course for, pushing 20 years. And during that time, I begin the course in a standard way. So I think the first time I did this, what I did on the first day of class was I showed a picture on the screen of George Washington. And then I showed a picture of George W. Bush, the president at the time. And I told the students in the class, our task, your task this semester, is to explain how the country got from George Washington to George W. Bush. Now, given sort of the state of the times and given the political mood in the United States, some of my students took this kind of as supposed to be a joke, haha, because George W. Bush is no George Washington. Some of the students who liked George Bush thought that I was making fun of him. In fact, not at all. And over the years, I always begin with George Washington, and then over time, the second image on the screen became Barack Obama. And of late, in the last 3 years, the first president is always still George Washington, but the current incumbent is Donald Trump. And so, George Washington to Donald Trump. How did we get from one to the other? Again, some people take it as a slight on Donald Trump. It's certainly not intended that way. Some people think that, I don't know, I guess maybe I'm likening Donald Trump to George Washington, but the whole point, that's not the point. The whole point is to explain how the institution of the presidency went from one in which George Washington was considered the best qualified person in the country to be president of the United States to one in which, well, now we're in the age of Donald Trump, how Donald Trump became the one best seen by voters, or more precisely seen by the Electoral College, and the voters who chose the Electoral College to be most qualified to be president of the United States. So this is the task before us. How we have to figure out how has the presidency evolved over time, because George Washington, for his strengths and weaknesses, was not the same person as Donald Trump, or Barack Obama, or George W. Bush. And so this is what we're up to. And the way we're going to deal with this is we will start at the beginning. And the beginning of the presidency is actually the Constitutional Convention of 1787. So what is it that the framers of the Constitution thought the presidency was going to be? What did they think it would require? How would they choose presidents and so on? We'll start there, and then we'll work our way through the presidents. And there are a few themes that I'll point out now that we'll observe as we go from the presidents of the 18th century to the presidents of the 21st century. And the first is the growth of the presidency, the growth of the powers of the presidency, and the growth of expectations of presidents. Now, expectations. Now, here I'm talking about what Americans think of the presidency, what they want out of the president. And this is an important, you could call it a secondary theme or subsidiary theme. This is, of course, on the history of the presidency, but it is as much a history of American voters because, well, we get the presidents we vote for. We get the presidents we deserve. And if the presidents change, if the character of the presidents change, if the role of the presidents change, then that is a reflection of what voters want the president to do, or at least what voters are willing to allow the president to do. And we'll see that there's a lot of back and forth between what voters demand of presidents, what voters ask of presidents, and then what presidents try to do, and see if voters will go along with it. So, to begin, at the beginning, Americans didn't expect much of their presidents. The Constitution includes the presidency only as Article 2 of the Constitution, and it's a much shorter article, much briefer, sketchier than Article 1. Article 1 is all about the Congress and what the powers of the Congress are and what Congress is supposed to do. This reflects the belief, the expectation of the framers of the Constitution that America's federal government was going to be driven by, the initiative was going to be taken by Congress, by the legislative branch. We have three branches of the federal government. The legislative branch, that's in Article 1 of the Constitution. The executive branch, that's only Article 2. And the judicial branch, that's Article 3. So, then there are several other articles after that explaining the connections between the two. But the first thing to keep in mind is that the president was not considered the driving force in American politics at the beginning. And the framers didn't want it that way. They'd had enough of a really strong executive, King George. They didn't want to have another King George, and the fact that the first president of the United States was named George, well, in fact, his critics began calling him King George when he seemed to be taking on more powers, more authority than the Constitution delegated to him. So at the beginning, the president was weak. The presidency was weak. And this was the theme through the 19th century, really up until Theodore Roosevelt became president at the beginning of the 20th century. And so one of the questions that I pose occasionally is, why is it that nobody can remember most presidents of the 19th century? And the short answer is, you were not supposed to. The framers of the Constitution intended that Congress would be where the action was. And presidents, it's called the executive branch because the president is simply supposed to execute the will of Congress. The president is not supposed to initiate things. The president responds. Congress acts, the president reacts. And that's the way it was through most of the 19th century. There were exceptions. There were moments, well, the Civil War is the best example, where the president had to step forward. And this because there was that specific clause in the Constitution that said that the president was commander-in-chief. And when there was a war, the Civil War, the president had to step forward. And I'll talk a lot, you'll read a lot about Abraham Lincoln and how the years he spent in the White House changed the presidency. Anyway, presidents of the 19th century were relatively unmemorable. So you get of 19th century presidents, which ones can you name really quickly? Well, Jefferson maybe, and probably, well, Andrew Jackson, and Lincoln, and who else? You know, if I say Harrison, which Harrison am I talking about? Can you identify either one of the Harrisons? And want to talk about Grover Cleveland. You know, he was the 22nd and the 24th president because he was the only one to be elected to non-consecutive terms. Anyway, so the presidency during the 19th century is fairly weak and unmemorable. But then we get to the 20th century, and the 20th century, and things change. They change all of a sudden. I'll explain the reasons why they change, but basically the United States bursts onto the world scene as a major power. And for the first time, the United States has a full-time foreign policy. And the president, besides being commander-in-chief, is de facto diplomat-in-chief. He's the one who guides American foreign policy. It also has to do with changes in communications technology. And so if you've got modern media, and we start getting modern media at the beginning of the 20th century, not what we would call media today, but mass circulation newspapers, that was the medium of the day. And they had to sell lots of papers and therefore generate lots of page views in order to make ends meet. And they had to tell gripping stories, and it's a lot easier to tell a gripping story about one person, a president, than about the hundreds of people, the big committee that makes up the U.S. Congress. So there are a series of things that push the president to the front of the American political arena until we are today, where you cannot pick up a major newspaper today. You cannot watch a television news show today without hearing something about the president. The president is front page news. Now, President Trump has made the president more consistent front page news than ever, given his use of social media, and particularly Twitter. And the things that he says that are newsworthy. He developed his media sensibilities on reality TV, so he knows what to do to focus the attention on himself. But there are all sorts of other things that have been driving in this direction. So the president has been front page news really since Theodore Roosevelt entered the White House in 1901. I can guarantee you the president was not front page news in the papers of the 1790s when George Washington and John Adams were president. He wasn't front page news during most of the 19th century. So things have changed. And some of this, as I say, has to do with America's role in the world. Some of it has to do with the media of the day. And some of it has to do simply with American expectations. So the presidency is this really big deal in the 21st century, and really starting in the 20th century until actually in the middle of the 20th century. In the middle of the 20th century, at the end of World War II, or during World War II, the President of the United States became widely recognized as the most powerful man on earth. And by the end of World War II and into the beginning of the Cold War, the President was commonly referred to as the leader of the free world. So being President of the United States was almost literally the biggest deal on earth. One of the questions we're going to consider in the course is that still the case? And if it is, what sustains that role for the president? If not, what has changed? Is it the people who've occupied the offices, the things that they've done, the things that they've said? Or is it the context in which, are there forces that operate on the presidency? And the answer, of course, is yes, there are. We'll talk about what those forces are. So we're going to talk about presidents, the presidency. We're going to talk about the people who have occupied the office. And until now, I'm speaking in summer of 2020, they've all been men. It was a close call. Hillary Clinton almost became president in 2016. And if that had been the case, then we'd be talking about, well, you can consider, would we be talking about a much different presidency, certainly a different president. So anyway, what have been, who's occupied the offices? What kind of people have been elected and have expectations or have demands? Has the resume of successful candidates for president, has that changed over time? In what way? So what is it that Americans are looking for in their president? And so looking at the presidency, the people who have occupied the office, the functions the president has to fulfill, the kinds of policies the president has to devise, how he interacts with Congress. And again, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of this is going to be set against the background of what are Americans expecting of the president. So how has the electorate changed? The people who made George Washington president were very different from the people who made Donald Trump president. And we'll talk about this. And people have opinions whether the folks who decided on George Washington were better decision makers than the people who chose Donald Trump. And in certain respects they were. In other respects, one of the things they didn't have is they didn't have the kind of legitimacy because it was a much smaller electorate, the group that elected George Washington. And Americans changed their minds about this in the 19th century. They said, no, everybody gets to be involved in choosing the president. And everybody in the 19th century wasn't everybody. We're going to talk about the expanding of the electorate. So how democracy with a small d came in. And so by the 1830s, pretty much every white male could vote. And that was a big expansion over the situation in the 1790s. But of course, that was still a minority of the population. And so then race restrictions on voting were eliminated by the 15th Amendment, although they were snuck back in by various subterfuges, runarounds, to keep black people, for the most part, from voting. Women were granted the vote in 1920. And so the electorate has expanded. And a fair question to ask, any historian should ask, is when the electorate expands, do demands made of the president expand? Do they change? When the electorate changes, do the demands of the president change? There were a lot of people who thought that if women get to vote in 1920, well then we're going to get a woman president pretty soon. Well, it's another century beyond that and we haven't had a woman president. And it's also worth noting that the United States is really a laggard in this regard. So nearly every other country that is at all democratic like the United States has had a woman chief executive, but not the United States. And again, it might be just we're a little bit slow and the next president, we're not going to get a woman president presumably in November of this year, but maybe in 2024. Anyhow, so these are the sort of things that we're going to be talking about. These are the sort of discussions we're going to have. These are the sort of questions we're going to be pondering. And I'm going to be guiding you. I'll be giving lectures that you'll watch. You'll be doing a lot of reading yourself. And before the end of the semester, you will be a historian. You will write a history of a presidency. Now, all the details that go on with, that are on the syllabus, I want you to read the syllabus closely, and I'll give more information on that. But just once again, welcome to the course on the history of the American presidency. I expect it to be a good semester, an interesting semester, and I look forward to sharing it with you.